The letter arrived on a Tuesday, a day already gray with the threat of rain and the heavier weight of a final notice from the power company tucked under a magnet on the fridge. Alara traced the raised lettering of the law firm's crest with a finger worn smooth from sorting mail at a distribution center, a job that paid just enough to make her poor with brutal consistency. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, an artifact from a world she only saw through the windows of buses spattered with city grime. Her landlord, Mr. Henderson, had handed it to her with a sneer, his eyes lingering on the eviction notice taped to her door. "Looks important," he'd said, the words a taunt. "Maybe someone's leaving you a fortune so you can finally pay your rent on time." The cruelty was as casual as breathing to him. Inside, the language was dense, a forest of legal terms, but the core message was clear. A man she'd never heard of, Silas Thorne, her great-great-uncle, had died. He had left her his entire estate. The estate consisted of a single asset, a derelict clock tower in the old industrial sector, a part of the city that progress had forgotten and decay had claimed as its own. Her neighbor, a woman whose kindness was worn thin by her own struggles, had looked at the legal document with pity. "The old Thorne Tower? Honey, nobody wants that dump. They say it's been silent for 100 years. Probably full of rats and ghosts, a dump." A forgotten, rat-infested tower was her inheritance. Felt less like a gift and more like a final, cosmic joke. If you are ready for a story about how a forgotten legacy can change everything, a story that proves value is not always what it seems, then hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We have a feeling you won't want to miss a second of this. Now, back to Alara, standing in her cramped kitchen with a letter that felt heavier than a tombstone. 100 years of silence. The phrase echoed in her mind, a hollow sound that matched the feeling in her chest. She looked at her 7-year-old son, Leo, who was meticulously drawing a spaceship on a piece of scrap paper, his brow furrowed in concentration. His world was small, contained within the 4 walls of this apartment and the asphalt playground of his school. She wanted to give him galaxies, but she could barely keep the lights on. This inheritance, this useless, crumbling tower, was just another reminder of all the things she couldn't provide. It was a monument to her family's obscurity, a final, rotting branch on a family tree she barely knew existed. She folded the letter, the crisp paper crackling in protest. A part of her wanted to throw it away, to pretend it never arrived, to focus on the immediate, terrifying problem of the electric bill. But another part, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, curiosity, held her back. Silas Thorne, a name that was a complete void. Why her? Why leave a legacy of rust and ruin to a descendant so distant she was practically a stranger? The tower stood in her mind's eye, a skeletal finger pointing at a sky the color of lead. A dump, maybe, but it was her dump. The thought was absurd, yet it settled in her with a strange sense of ownership, a feeling as foreign and unsettling as the lawyer's expensive stationery. That night, long after Leo was asleep, his quiet breathing the only sound in the apartment, Alara sat by the window, watching the distant, indifferent glow of the city. The eviction notice on her door seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. She was trapped, fighting a current that was always pulling her under. The clock tower, for all its uselessness, was something else. It was a mystery. It was a tangible piece of a past she never knew she had. It was a question waiting for an answer, and for the first time in a long, long time, she felt the pull of something other than desperation. She had to see it. She had to stand in its shadow and understand what, if anything, this silent giant had to say to her. The decision was not born of hope, but of a quiet, stubborn refusal to be defined solely by the notices taped to her door. She would go. She would face the rats and the ghosts and the 100 years of silence. She would claim her inheritance, no matter how worthless it seemed to the rest of the world. Because in a life of having nothing, owning a piece of the sky, even a broken piece, felt like a start. She looked at the city again, at the endless grid of lights representing lives and fortunes she couldn't imagine. Out there, somewhere in the forgotten darkness, was her tower, waiting. The bus ride to the industrial sector was a journey backward in time. The gleaming glass and steel of the downtown core gave way to brick warehouses with shattered windows, their facades tattooed with faded advertisements for products that no longer existed. The air grew thick with the ghosts of coal smoke and industry, a gritty film that coated the bus windows and settled in Alara's lungs. She held the large, ornate iron key the lawyer had given her, its weight a solid, cold reality in her trembling hand. It felt ancient, a key to a castle or a dungeon, not a forgotten building on the edge of the city. Leo was with her, his small hand clutching hers, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. To him, this was a grand adventure, a trip to see a real-life giant's castle. Alara wished she could share his innocence, but all she felt was a growing sense of dread. The bus wheezed to a stop, its doors hissing open onto a desolate street. And there it was. The Thorn Tower was not just a building. It was a wound in the sky. It rose from a tangle of weeds and cracked concrete, a Gothic spire of dark, weathered stone and tarnished copper. It was taller than she had imagined, so tall that it seemed to scrape against the bruised underbelly of the clouds. The clock face, high above, was a blank white eye, its hands frozen at 3:15, a moment trapped in amber for a century. The silence around it was profound. The distant hum of the city was a memory here. The only sound was the wind, a low moan that whispered through the tower's broken louvers and skeletal ironwork. "Wow," Leo breathed, his voice a small, reverent sound in the oppressive quiet. Alara could only nod, her throat tight. It was terrifyingly beautiful, a monument of decay. It wasn't a dump. It was a tomb. They picked their way through the debris-strewn yard. A rusted fence sagged, its gate long since surrendered to the weeds. The main doors were massive, made of oak planks bound with iron straps, scarred by weather and time. The keyhole was a dark gash in the wood. With Leo watching, his face a mask of anticipation, Alara pushed the heavy key into the lock. It resisted, grating with a sound of metal on rust that set her teeth on edge. She put her shoulder into it, turning with all her weight. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, groaning shudder that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the building, the lock turned. The sound echoed in the silence, a monstrous, final exhalation. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, opening a sliver of darkness into the world. The air that flowed out was cool and musty, carrying the scent of damp stone, decaying paper, and something else, something metallic and sharp, like old oil and ozone. It was the smell of a machine that had been asleep for a very long time. Alara hesitated at the threshold. The darkness inside was absolute, a solid wall of black that her eyes couldn't penetrate. Felt like stepping into a mouth. Leo, however, tugged at her hand, his fear forgotten, replaced by a boundless curiosity. "Come on, Mom. Let's go in." Taking a deep breath, Alara pulled her phone from her pocket, its flashlight a weak, pale spear against the immense darkness. She stepped inside, and the sound of the heavy door swinging shut behind her was a deafening boom, a final, irrevocable severing from the outside world. They were in a vast, cavernous space. The flashlight beam danced across the floor, revealing flagstones slick with moisture and coated in a century of dust. Great, ghostly shapes draped in white cloths loomed in the periphery, likely old furniture or equipment. High above, far beyond the reach of her light, the space disappeared into a cathedral of shadows. The only feature she could make out was a staircase, a spiral of wrought iron that clung to the stone wall, ascending into the blackness like a skeletal spine. Dust motes, thick as insects, swirled in the beam of her phone. A silent, glittering galaxy disturbed for the first time in generations. The silence in here was different. It wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with the presence of the immense, dormant machine that surrounded them. She could almost feel the weight of the silent bells above, the stillness of the colossal gears. It was the silence of arrested motion, of potential energy waiting for a release that would never come. Leo whispered, "Is this where the giant lives?" Alara squeezed his hand. "No, baby. This is where the timekeeper lived, The words came out unbidden, and she was surprised by them herself. She hadn't thought of her great-great-uncle as a timekeeper, but standing here, in the belly of his creation, it felt right. He hadn't just owned a tower. He had been its heart, its guardian. She swept the light upwards, following the curve of the iron staircase. It seemed to go on forever, a dizzying ascent into nothing. She knew somewhere up there was the clockwork, the pendulum, the very soul of the building. But the thought of climbing those stairs, of venturing deeper into the cold, silent dark, was overwhelming. For now, it was enough to simply be here, to stand on the floor of her inheritance and feel its immensity. She felt small, an intruder in a place that held secrets she couldn't begin to comprehend. The light from her phone flickered, the battery warning flashing on the screen. It was a jarring intrusion of the modern world, a reminder of her own limitations. They couldn't stay. With one last look into the soaring darkness above, she guided Leo back toward the massive doors. Pushing them open against their colossal weight, she was blinded by the sudden, gray light of the afternoon. The transition was jarring, from the tomb-like silence of the tower to the muted, mundane sounds of the forgotten street. As she locked the door, the loud clang of the bolts sliding home felt like a promise. Promise to return. Standing once more in the shadow of the tower, she looked up at the frozen clock face. 3:15. She wondered what had happened at that exact moment 100 years ago to silence it. What had stopped the heart of this giant? The tower was no longer just a building. It was a question, an anchor to a past she was now inextricably tied to. It was a responsibility she didn't want but could no longer ignore. The weight of the key in her pocket was different now. It was no longer just a piece of iron. It was the key to a story, her story, and she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and thrilling, that she had to find out how it ended. To understand the tower, Elara knew she first had to understand the man who built it. The law firm had provided only a name and a relation, a skeletal fact with no flesh on it. Silas Thorne. The name felt like a whisper from another century. Her search began at the city's municipal archives, a hushed, solemn building that smelled of aging paper and floor wax. It was a library of ghosts, where the city's dead lived on in brittle documents and faded ink. She approached the main desk, feeling out of place, a trespasser in this temple of history. The man behind the counter was as much a fixture as the dusty card catalogs. He was elderly, with skin like parchment and eyes that magnified a lifetime of reading through thick, wire-rimmed glasses. A small brass plaque on his desk read, Arthur Abernathy, Head Archivist. He looked up as she approached, his expression one of mild, scholarly curiosity. "May I help you?" he asked, his voice a dry rustle. Elara explained her situation, her voice sounding small and uncertain in the grand, silent room. She told him about the inheritance, the tower, and the name. Silas Thorne. At the mention of the name, Mr. Abernathy's eyebrows lifted slightly, a subtle shift that spoke of recognition. He peered at her over his glasses, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Thorne?" he repeated, the name rolling off his tongue with a familiar cadence. "The horologist of the West Ward. An interesting man, a tragic figure in some ways. Most people have forgotten him. And the tower," he sighed, a soft, dusty sound. "They see it as an eyesore now, a relic. They've forgotten what it was meant to be." He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. "Come with me." He led her through a labyrinth of tall, rolling shelves, the air growing cooler and drier as they went deeper into the building's heart. He stopped before a large, leather-bound ledger and ran a gnarled finger down a list of names until he found it. Thorne, Silas. B. 1868. D. 1923. He pulled the file, a thick manila folder bulging with documents, and carried it to a heavy oak table under a pool of warm light from a green-shaded lamp. For the next several hours, with Mr. Abernathy as her guide, Elara pieced together the life of her ancestor. The documents painted a portrait of a brilliant, determined, and deeply private man. Silas Thorne was a master horologist, a maker and keeper of clocks, but he was more than that. He was an inventor, an engineer, a self-taught genius. He had filed patents for intricate gear systems and magnetic regulators that were decades ahead of their time. He was also a black man who had built a business and a reputation in an era that actively sought to deny him both. The newspaper clippings were telling. Early articles spoke of him with a tone of patronizing wonder, a credit to his race, a marvel of mechanical aptitude. But as his ambition grew, as he began construction on the tower, a project funded entirely by his own patents and the support of his community, the tone shifted. He was called eccentric, a recluse, his grand project a folly. There were hints of darker things, too. Business dealings that soured, partnerships that dissolved under mysterious circumstances, and whispers of powerful rivals who saw his success as a threat. He was building more than a clock, Abernathy explained, his voice low. In those days, a public clock was a symbol of civic pride, of progress. It was a town's heartbeat. For a black man to build the grandest one in the city, it was a statement. It was a declaration of presence, of permanence. Some people didn't like that. The tower was completed in 1922. It ran for a single year. Then, in the autumn of 1923, at 3:15 in the afternoon, it stopped. And so did Silas Thorne. The official cause of death was listed as a heart ailment, but Abernathy gestured to a small, yellowed article tucked away at the back of the file. The headline was small. Prominent inventor dies suddenly. There was no investigation, no fanfare. He was simply gone, and his great clock fell silent with him. The city forgot him with a speed that felt deliberate. His story was buried, an inconvenient piece of history that didn't fit the preferred narrative. They say he had a secret, Abernathy said, looking at Alara intently. A hidden workshop, a final invention. Some even whispered he'd found a way to manipulate time itself. Nonsense, of course. But stories like that stick to men like him. Men who live ahead of their own time. The archivist seemed to sense the weight of the information settling on Alara. He reached under his desk and retrieved a small, heavy object wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a book. It was a journal, its leather cover cracked and dark with age, embossed with a simple, elegant design of interlocking gears. This was in his file, Abernathy said. It was logged as a book of technical drawings, nothing more. But I've always felt it was something else. I'm not supposed to do this, but a man's legacy shouldn't be left to gather dust on a shelf. He pushed the journal across the table to Alara. His family never claimed his effects. You are his family. It belongs to you. Alara stared at the journal. It felt warm to the touch, alive with the energy of the man who had filled its pages. This was it. This was the real inheritance. Not the stone and iron of the tower, but this. The thoughts, the secrets, the voice of Silas Thorne. She looked up at Mr. Abernathy, her throat thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "Thank you," she whispered. He simply nodded, a small, sad smile on his lips. "Time tells all, my dear," he said softly. "You just have to know how to listen." Leaving the archives, the gray afternoon felt different. The city was no longer just a place she lived. It was a place that held her history, a history that had been deliberately erased. The tower was not a folly or a dump. It was a statement, a defiant act of creation. And now, she held its heart in her hands. That night, with Leo asleep and the city humming its distant lullaby, Alara sat at her small kitchen table and opened the journal. The first page was a swirl of elegant, looping script. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. Time is the only true inheritance. It is a machine with one purpose, to reveal what is hidden. The journal was not a diary of daily events, but a map of a mind. Its pages were a dense tapestry of complex schematics, mathematical equations, and philosophical reflections on the nature of time, physics, and legacy. Silas Thorne's handwriting was precise, the script of a man who believed in order and structure. Yet, woven between the technical drawings of escapements and gear trains were passages of profound and often sorrowful beauty. Alara spent every spare moment poring over the book, a dictionary on one side and her laptop on the other, trying to decipher the archaic technical terms and the cryptic, allegorical language. Leo would often sit beside her, drawing his own intricate machines, a silent partner in her quest. At first, the entries seemed disconnected. A detailed analysis of the resonant frequency of brass alloys would be followed by a short, poignant reflection. A bell cannot be unrung. A word cannot be unsaid. A life, once lived, leaves an echo that never truly fades. The trick is to build a chamber that can hold the sound. He wrote about his work with an almost religious fervor. The clock was not just a machine to him. It was a living entity. He referred to the great pendulum not as a pendulum, but as the regulator. The central clockwork mechanism was the heartbeat. The tower itself was the vessel. He seemed to be building a body, an automaton of colossal scale. As she read deeper, a recurring theme emerged. Silas was obsessed with the idea of preservation. They can burn our businesses, he wrote in one angry, slanted script. They can steal our patents. They can erase our names from the ledgers. But they cannot steal what is built to last, what is hidden in plain sight, protected by the steady, unblinking march of time itself. A chill went down Alara's spine. This was more than an inventor's notebook. It was a testament. It was a plan. She began to notice a pattern in the schematics. Certain diagrams were marked with a small, stylized drawing of a key. These were not standard engineering blueprints. They showed strange modifications to the clockwork, hidden compartments, and mechanisms that seemed to have no function in traditional timekeeping. One passage in particular caught her eye. The heartbeat must be silenced before the chamber can be revealed. The sequence is the key. The lion's tooth must release the serpent's tail at the hour of stillness. The regulator must be at rest, its arc complete. Only then will the path be opened. Lion's tooth? Serpent's tail? Hour of stillness? It sounded like poetry, not instructions. She felt a surge of frustration. It was a riddle locked in the language of a dead man. She almost gave up, convinced she was chasing ghosts, reading too much into the ramblings of an eccentric old man. She put the journal down and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. Her own life felt just as stuck, just as silent as the tower. The final notice from the power company was still on the fridge, now glowing an angry red. The threat of eviction was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety. This quest, this obsession with the past, felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. But then she thought of Mr. Abernathy's words. Time tells all. She went back to the table, her resolve hardening. She would not let this go. She looked at the cryptic passage again, this time with a new perspective. Silas was a horologist, a clockmaker. The language had to be mechanical. She cross-referenced the terms with old horological textbooks she found online. The lion's tooth was a type of gear tooth, the serpent's tail a part of the escapement mechanism. The hour of stillness could refer to noon or midnight, a time of transition. And the regulator must be at rest. The pendulum had to be stopped at the very bottom of its swing. It was a sequence, a set of precise, physical actions to be performed within the clockwork itself. A new diagram on the following page confirmed her theory. It was a drawing of the main gear assembly. The heartbeat 3 specific gears were circled and labeled with celestial symbols: Mars, Venus, and Saturn. Beside the drawing was a simple, stark instruction. Align the marks when the sun is at its zenith noon. She had to be in the tower at noon and manually align the marks on 3 specific gears. The journal was not just a book. It was an instruction manual. Silas Thorne had left her a map, a series of steps to unlock the tower's final secret. A surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp, coursed through her. This was it. This was what he had been protecting. The knowledge was terrifying. It meant returning to the tower, climbing into its dark, silent heart, and meddling with a machine that had been dormant for a century. The thought of the immense, rusted gears, of the darkness and the silence, filled her with a primal fear. But the fear was overshadowed by a more powerful force, the desperate, burning need to know. She looked over at Leo, asleep on the couch, his face peaceful in the dim light. She was doing this for him. She was doing this to change the relentless, grinding rhythm of their lives. She had inherited a silent clock, but maybe, just maybe, Silas Thorne had left her a way to start it again. With the journal open in front of her, she began to plan. She would need tools: a heavy wrench, a crowbar, rope, and powerful flashlights. She felt like a safecracker preparing for a heist. In a way, she was preparing to break into her own history, to unlock a legacy that had been waiting patiently for 100 years. The next day, under a clear, bright sky, she would return to the tower. She would climb the skeletal stairs and face the heartbeat. She would follow the map left by the ghost. The air inside the tower was even colder and more stagnant than she remembered. Alara stood in the vast, dark entrance hall, a heavy canvas bag of tools slung over her shoulder. Leo was at a neighbor's, a small act of deception that weighed on her conscience. But she could not bring him into this. This was a journey she had to make alone. The beam of her new, powerful flashlight cut a clean, white circle through the oppressive gloom, illuminating the base of the iron spiral staircase. It looked like the fossilized remains of some great sea creature, twisting up into an abyss of blackness. Every footstep echoed, amplified by the cavernous space. The sound of her own breathing was loud, ragged. She began to climb. The iron steps were cold and slick with a fine layer of damp grime. The railing felt loose under her hand. With every turn of the spiral, the single rectangle of light from the entrance door grew smaller, the connection to the outside world more tenuous. She climbed past landings that opened into empty, dust-choked rooms, their purpose lost to time. She saw the ghostly outlines of workbenches, shelves, and strange, skeletal pieces of machinery, all draped in the thick, white shrouds of a century's neglect. The silence was absolute, broken only by her own laboring breath and the rhythmic creak of the iron stairs. After what felt like an eternity, the staircase opened onto a vast, circular chamber. This was it, the heart of the tower. The room was dominated by the clockwork mechanism, a monstrous, intricate sculpture of iron and brass. Gears the size of tables stood frozen, interlocked in a silent, complex embrace. Levers, cams, and drive shafts formed a metallic forest that filled the center of the chamber. It was larger and more intimidating than any of Silas's diagrams could convey. It was a sleeping giant, and she was an ant crawling upon its skin. Her flashlight beam played across the surfaces, glinting off brass that had turned a dull, verdigris green and iron that was coated in a fine red dust of rust. High above, for massive drive shafts led out toward the clock faces on each side of the tower. And in the center of it all, hanging from a colossal mounting bracket in the ceiling, was the top of the pendulum, the regulator, a thick steel rod that descended through an opening in the floor into the darkness below. She checked her watch.
11:50 a.m.
She had 10 minutes. She found the gears from the journal's diagram. They were massive. The one marked with the symbol for Mars was taller than she was. The celestial markings, faint but discernible, were carved into their surfaces. They were nowhere near alignment. Panic fluttered in her chest. How could she possibly move them? They must weigh tons. She circled the mechanism, her light probing its depths, searching for a clue. Then she saw it. A long iron lever, connected to a secondary gear system, with a hand crank at the end. It was a manual override, a maintenance clutch. Silas had built a way to disengage the main drive and move the gears by hand. It was an act of incredible foresight. She put her hands on the crank. It was stiff with rust and disuse. She threw her entire body into it, gritting her teeth. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a hideous, grinding shriek of metal on metal that echoed through the chamber like a scream, the clutch disengaged. The giant was unlocked. Now for the gears. She found a heavy, long-spoked wheel near the base of the Mars gear, clearly designed for manual turning. She wedged her feet against the frame of the machine and pulled. The wheel resisted, groaning in protest. Her muscles screamed. Sweat beaded on her forehead, stinging her eyes. Slowly, agonizingly, millimeter by millimeter, the colossal gear began to turn. The sound was deafening, a deep, resonant groan that vibrated through the floor, through the soles of her feet, and into her bones. One by one, she moved the 3 great wheels, her body aching, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She watched the celestial marks, etched into the brass, creep toward their counterparts. Venus slid into place, then Saturn. Finally, with a last, desperate heave, she aligned the mark on the Mars gear. A deep, resonant thud echoed through the machine as the final tumbler fell into place. The time on her phone read 12 p.m. She had done it. For a moment, she just stood there, panting, her heart hammering against her ribs. Nothing happened. A wave of crushing disappointment washed over her. Had she been wrong? Was it all just a madman's fantasy? She sagged against the cold iron of the machine, the smell of rust and old oil filling her senses. And then she heard it, a soft click. It was so quiet she thought she'd imagined it. It was followed by another, then a low hydraulic hiss. Her eyes darted around the room, trying to find the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from below. She moved to the opening in the floor where the pendulum rod disappeared. The sound was louder there. A low, deep grinding, the sound of stone on stone. She shone her flashlight down into the shaft. The pendulum hung perfectly still, its massive brass bob a gleaming teardrop in the darkness. But it wasn't the pendulum that held her attention. It was the wall behind it. A section of the thick, stone cylindrical wall of the pendulum chamber, a section that had looked solid, was moving. A vertical seam of black had appeared, widening slowly as a massive, curved section of the wall receded into the tower's structure. It moved with a smooth, silent precision that spoke of incredible engineering. The opening revealed a dark, hollow space within the tower's massive foundation. The air that drifted up from it was different from the musty air of the clock room. It was dry, and it smelled of old leather, cedar, and metal. It was the smell of a vault. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She had found it. Silas Thorne's secret chamber. With trembling hands, she secured a rope from her bag to the solid frame of the clockwork and lowered herself down into the shaft, her feet finding purchase on the top of the pendulum's bob. From there, she swung into the newly revealed opening. She was in a small, circular room, its stone walls perfectly cut. The beam of her flashlight swept across the space and fell upon what was inside. Stacks of heavy, iron-banded chests, each the size of a large suitcase, were piled neatly from floor to ceiling. There were dozens of them. They were covered in a fine layer of dust but were otherwise pristine, protected from the damp and the decay of the world outside. With shaking fingers, she approached the nearest chest. It was not locked, but sealed with a simple latch. She lifted the iron hasp, the sound loud in the enclosed space, and raised the heavy lid. Her breath caught in her throat. The flashlight beam illuminated the contents, and for a moment, her brain refused to process what she was seeing. The chest was filled with neat, paper-banded stacks of United States gold certificates from the early 1920s. Beneath them, nestled in felt-lined compartments, were hundreds of gold coins, and underneath those solid, heavy bars of gold bullion, each stamped with its weight and purity. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. She opened another chest. It was the same. And another. All of them. It was a fortune. A king's ransom. A treasure that defied comprehension. Hidden in the heart of a silent clock. The number the lawyers would later calculate was an abstraction. A string of digits that had no meaning. $387 million. But in that moment it wasn't a number. It was the weight of 100 years of silence, the physical manifestation of a forgotten legacy, and the terrifying, brilliant, impossible answer to every prayer she had ever whispered into the darkness. The world outside the tower had not changed. The sky was the same indifferent gray. The city hummed with the same distant, relentless energy. But for Alara, everything was different. The very air she breathed felt altered, charged with the impossible secret she now carried. She had left the chamber untouched, closing the heavy chests, resealing the hidden door by reversing the gear sequence. The tower held its breath once more, its treasure secure within its stone heart. But the secret was not in the tower. It was in her. It was a screaming, vibrant thing that lived behind her eyes, isolating her from the rest of humanity. She returned to her apartment, to the eviction notice and the flickering lights, and the sheer, brutal absurdity of it all almost made her laugh. She was one of the wealthiest people on the planet, and she was worried about a $74 electric bill. The days that followed were a blur of surreal tension. She went to work at the mail sorting facility, her hands moving automatically, her mind a million miles away, in a dark, cold chamber filled with gold. The complaints of her coworkers, the drone of the machinery, the petty frustrations of her life, they all seemed to be happening to someone else, a character in a play she was no longer a part of. The money was a ghost that haunted her every waking moment. It was a solution to all her problems, and yet it was the biggest problem of all. How could she access it? Moving that much gold and antique currency would be impossible without attracting the kind of attention that would lead to questions she couldn't answer. Who was Silas Thorne? Where did he get this fortune? Was it legal? The sheer scale of it suggested it couldn't be. Telling anyone, even a lawyer, felt like an insurmountable risk. The secret was a cage, and she was its only prisoner. Paranoia began to set in. Every stranger's glance on the street felt like scrutiny. Every official-looking envelope in the mail sent a jolt of fear through her. She felt exposed, as if the secret were written on her forehead in glowing letters. She was terrified of losing it, and just as terrified of what would happen if she tried to use it. Her relationship with Leo became strained. He could sense her distraction, her anxiety. "Are you sad about the giant's castle, Mom?" he asked one evening, his small face etched with worry. She pulled him close, burying her face in his hair, the scent of him a grounding, familiar comfort in her new, unmoored reality. "No, baby," she whispered. "The castle is amazing. It's just a very big." It was in the midst of this quiet, internal chaos that the first external pressure arrived. It came in the form of a letter, but this one was not from a dusty law firm. It was on thick, glossy cardstock, embossed with a sleek, modern logo, Ethelred Development Corporation. The letter was polite but firm, an iron fist in a velvet glove. It was an offer to purchase the Thorne Tower property. The amount they offered was insulting, a fraction of what the land alone was worth, even in its derelict state. It was the kind of lowball offer a predator makes, assuming the owner is desperate and uninformed. Alara's first instinct was to tear it up. But the next day, she received a phone call. The man's voice was smooth, polished, and utterly devoid of warmth. He introduced himself as Julian Sterling, a senior acquisitions executive with Ethelred. "Ms. Thorne," he said, his voice like oiled machinery. "I'm calling to follow up on our generous offer for your inheritance. We feel it's a more than fair price for a property that is, frankly, a liability. The city has long considered it a blight, and demolition orders are not out of the question." His tone was condescending, his words laced with a veiled threat. He spoke of the tower as if it were a piece of trash he was doing her a favor by hauling away. "We have ambitious plans for that district," he continued, his voice taking on a synthetic, visionary quality. "A new commercial hub, luxury condos. We're revitalizing the area. Your crumbling tower stands in the way of progress." Alara felt a cold knot of anger tighten in her stomach. His casual dismissal of the tower, of Silas's legacy, was a personal affront. "It's not for sale," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. There was a pause on the other end of the line. She could almost hear Sterling's smile. "Everything is for sale, Miss Thorne," he said softly. "It's just a matter of finding the right price, or the right pressure. Think about our offer. We are very persistent." He hung up. The click of the phone echoed in the silent apartment. The conversation left her shaken. Sterling's confidence was unnerving. Felt like he knew more than he was letting on. Did he suspect something? Or was this just the standard operating procedure for a ruthless development firm? She didn't know, but for the first time, the threat to the tower felt real and immediate. It was no longer just a battle against her own fear and paranoia. There was an antagonist now, a face to the forces of greed that Silas had written about in his journal. Julian Sterling and Ethelred Development were the modern incarnation of the rivals who had tried to erase him a century ago. The weight of her secret grew heavier. The money was no longer just a potential salvation. It was a motive. If Sterling ever found out what was inside that tower, he wouldn't just be persistent. He would be relentless. He would be dangerous. The silent, forgotten clock tower was suddenly the center of a battle she was completely unprepared to fight. She was a single mother who sorted mail for a living, and her opponent was a multi-million-dollar corporation. The fight was unwinnable. But as she stood in her kitchen, the memory of Sterling's smug, dismissive voice in her ear, she felt a flicker of the same defiant stubbornness that had led her to the tower in the first place. This was Silas's legacy. It was her legacy, and she would not let it be bulldozed for luxury condos. Julian Sterling was true to his word. He was persistent. The letters from Ethelred Development became more frequent, the offers incrementally higher but still insultingly low. They were followed by phone calls, each one a masterclass in polite intimidation. Sterling spoke of zoning laws, eminent domain, and public safety citations, his smooth voice weaving a web of bureaucratic threats designed to overwhelm and confuse her. Alara ignored them, but the constant pressure began to wear her down. Then the attack shifted. One morning, a bright orange notice was plastered on the tower's main door. It was a formal citation from the city's Department of Buildings, declaring the structure an unsafe and hazardous property. It listed a dozen violations, from falling masonry to risk of collapse, and gave her 30 days to submit a comprehensive engineering report and a plan for remediation, a task that would cost tens of thousands of dollars she didn't have. She knew with a sickening certainty that Ethelred was behind it. They were using the city as their weapon, leveraging their influence to create a problem only they could solve by buying the property and demolishing it. The strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. She was trapped. She had a fortune that could solve the problem 100 times over, but using it would expose her secret and create a far greater danger. If she did nothing, she would lose the tower and everything inside it to the city's wrecking ball. She felt like a character in a Greek tragedy, cursed by a paradoxical fate. The solution to her poverty was the one thing she could not use. Her desperation drove her back to the one person who seemed to understand the tower's significance: Arthur Abernathy. She found him in his usual spot at the archives, surrounded by stacks of books, a small island of order in a sea of history. She explained the situation, the pressure from Ethelred, the citation from the city. She didn't mention the money. The secret was too vast, too dangerous to share. But she described the corporate harassment with a frantic energy. Abernathy listened patiently, his steepled fingers resting on his chin. When she was finished, he wasn't surprised. He simply nodded, a deep sadness in his magnified eyes. Ethelred, he said, the name tasting like poison. They are not developers. They are erasers. They have done this before. They find properties with historical significance, particularly those tied to minority communities, run the owners into the ground with legal fees and city violations, and then acquire the land for pennies on the dollar. They sanitize history, replacing it with glass and steel. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Men like your great-great-uncle Alara, men who built things that were meant to last, they often made powerful enemies. The families who ran this city 100 years ago, the ones who resented Silas Thorne's success, their names are still on the letterheads of banks and law firms. Their greed has a long memory. It echoes through generations. It's very possible that Ethelred's interest in the tower is not just about the land. It may be ancestral. The idea sent a fresh wave of ice through Alara's veins. This wasn't just a random corporate land grab. This was personal. This was the continuation of a century-old conflict. Sterling wasn't just a developer. He was the heir to the very forces that had silenced Silas and his clock. The fight felt even more hopeless now. She wasn't just fighting a corporation. She was fighting history itself. She confessed her feeling of powerlessness, her voice cracking. What can I do? I have no money, no influence. They have everything. Abernathy looked at her, his gaze firm. You have the tower, he said simply. And you have his story. Those things have a power that money can't buy. Greed is powerful, my dear, but it is not patient. And it is not smart. It underestimates things it cannot assign a dollar value to. Things like legacy. Things like truth. He stood and walked to a row of tall map cabinets. He pulled out a large, rolled-up document. It was the original architectural plan for the Thorn Tower, dated 1920. The blueprint was a work of art, every line drawn with a steady, confident hand. Silas Thorne was a meticulous record keeper, Abernathy said, pointing to a block of text in the corner. He used materials and construction techniques that were revolutionary for his time. A reinforced concrete core, a self-lubricating gear system. He built it to withstand a siege. He built it to last 1,000 years. He tapped a finger on the blueprint. The answer is not in fighting them on their terms. The answer is in the tower itself. You need to understand what he built. Not just the secrets it holds, but the strength in its very bones. You need to find his voice again. He meant the journal. Elara had been so consumed by the discovery of the money that she had neglected the rest of it. She had seen it as a means to an end, a map to a treasure. She hadn't considered that it might hold another kind of key, the key to its own salvation. She left the archives with a renewed, if fragile, sense of purpose. The threat was no longer an abstract pressure. It was a clear and present danger, a generational war she had unwittingly inherited. She was outmatched and outmaneuvered, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. But Abernathy was right. She had the tower. She had the journal. She had the story. The first threat had been fired, and she had survived it. Now she had to find the ammunition to fire back. That night, she opened the journal again. But this time, she wasn't looking for clues to a hidden chamber. She was looking for a weapon. She was searching for the voice of the man who had built a fortress and called it a clock. Elara read the journal with a new, desperate intensity. She was no longer a treasure hunter. She was a strategist, searching for a defense in the words of a long-dead general. She bypassed the technical schematics and focused on Silas's more personal entries, the passages where his anger, his pride, and his purpose bled through the precise, controlled script. It was there, in the final third of the book, in a section she had previously skimmed, that she found what she was looking for. The handwriting changed. It became smaller, more compressed, as if he were trying to fit a lifetime of secrets into a few precious pages. He had used a different ink, one that was only visible when the page was held at a specific angle to the light, a simple but effective trick of concealment. It was a final confession, a last will and testament of his true purpose. "They think my tower a monument to vanity," he wrote. "Let them. They are blind to its true function. It is not a clock. It is a bank. It is a vault. It is an ark, built to carry the dreams of my people through a century of storms." The words struck Elara with the force of a physical blow. A bank. An ark. He went on to explain everything. The fortune in the pendulum chamber was not his alone. It was the combined wealth of a thriving community of black entrepreneurs, artisans, and professionals from his era. It was the life savings of dozens of families who had built successful businesses against impossible odds, only to see them threatened by the jealousy and violence of the white establishment. They had faced discriminatory banking practices, arson, and outright theft. They could not trust the system to protect their prosperity, so they created their own. Silas, with his engineering genius and reputation for discretion, was chosen as their guardian. The tower was their solution, a fortress disguised as a civic monument. The money, converted into untraceable gold and currency, was a freedom fund, a legacy to be preserved and grown in silence, waiting for a time when it could be safely used. "I have designed the vessel to be its own guardian," he wrote. "Its heart must be stopped for the vault to be accessed. Its mechanism is the key, its silence the lock. It is to be passed down through my line, to a descendant who will understand that this wealth is not a prize to be won, but a seed to be planted. It is not for the enrichment of one, but for the empowerment of many." Elara felt the weight of his words settle upon her, a burden heavier than all the gold in the chamber. The money was not hers. It had never been hers. She was not an heiress. She was a custodian, a guardian. The moral dilemma that had tormented her dissolved, replaced by a terrifying, clarifying purpose. Her fear of using the money, her paranoia about being discovered. It had all been rooted in a selfish, personal desire for escape. But the money was never meant for her escape. It was meant for building. It was meant to fulfill the century-old promise made to the people who had entrusted their futures to this tower. The revelation was both a crushing weight and a profound liberation. The choice was no longer hers to make. Silas had made it for her 100 years ago. Her purpose was not to hide the money, but to use it as it was intended. The thought was still terrifying. How could she, a mail sorter from a rundown apartment, possibly manage such a thing? How could she channel a fortune of that magnitude into the world without exposing its illicit origins and being crushed by the very systems it was meant to bypass? She looked at her sleeping son, his small chest rising and falling in the dim light. The fund was for him and for children like him. It was a legacy of opportunity, of security, of freedom from the grinding, daily struggle that had defined her own life. This was about more than saving a building from demolition. It was about resurrecting a dream. This new knowledge changed the nature of her fight against Sterling and Ethelred. It was no longer a personal battle over property. It was a sacred duty to protect the Ark. Ethelred wasn't just trying to build condos. They were trying to demolish a dream, to erase the last trace of a community's defiant act of self-preservation. Her fear began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard anger. It was the anger of a protector, a guardian defending her charge. She was no longer just Alara Thorne, a struggling single mother. She was the keeper of the Freedom Fund, the living heir to Silas Thorne's promise. She now had a weapon far more powerful than money. She had a righteous cause. Armed with this purpose, a plan began to form in her mind, a gamble so audacious it took her breath away. She couldn't fight Ethelred with money, not directly, but she could fight them with history. She could fight them with the truth. She would not reveal the secret of the vault, but she would reveal the secret of the tower itself. She would tell the world what it truly was. Not a derelict clock tower, but a monument to black achievement, a symbol of a history that the city had tried to bury. She would turn Ethelred's sanitized narrative of progress against them. She would make them the villains in a story of historical preservation. The fight would become public. It would be a battle for the city's soul. To do this, she would need help. She would need a lawyer, a historian, and a public platform. And to get those things, she would have to do the one thing she feared most. She would have to open one of the chests. She would have to take a small piece of the treasure and use it to save the rest. The decision felt like a betrayal, a violation of Silas's trust. But as she read his final words, she knew it was what he would have wanted. "A seed is useless if it is never planted," he had written. "A promise is empty if it is never kept. The guardian must have the wisdom to know when the silence must be broken." The act of taking the gold felt like a desecration. Alara returned to the tower under the cover of darkness, her movements swift and precise. She opened the vault, the mechanism now familiar to her, and entered the chamber of chests. The sheer, silent weight of the fortune was still overwhelming, but her purpose was clear. She chose a single, heavy gold bar from the bottom of one of the chests. It was cool and dense in her hands, an object of impossible value that felt like a lead weight on her conscience. She wrapped it in cloth and placed it in her bag, a single seed taken from a vast, sleeping forest. The process of converting the gold into usable currency was a nerve-wracking journey into a world of shadows she never knew existed. Through careful, anonymous online research, she found a discreet, out-of-state dealer in precious metals, a man who asked no questions and dealt only in cash. The transaction was tense and terrifying, conducted in the back room of a nondescript pawn shop 300 miles from her city. She left with a duffel bag containing a sum of money that was still staggering, but a tiny, untraceable fraction of the whole. It was the seed money for her war. Her first act was to hire a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but the best. She sought out a woman named Alani Hassan, a brilliant, fiercely independent attorney, who specialized in historical preservation and pro bono cases against corporate overreach. Alani was known for her sharp mind and her even sharper tongue, a dragon slayer who delighted in taking down corporate Goliaths. Their first meeting was in Alani's small, cluttered office, which was filled with more books than furniture. Alara told her the story, not the whole story, but the parts that mattered. She told her about Silas Thorne, the forgotten black inventor. She showed her the journal, presenting it as a family heirloom. She spoke of the tower's architectural and cultural significance, using the knowledge she'd gleaned from Silas's writings and Abernathy's research. She framed the fight as a desperate attempt to save her family's legacy from a predatory developer. She explained her sudden access to funds as a small inheritance from another branch of the family, a lie that felt thin and brittle on her tongue. Alani listened, her eyes narrowed, her expression unreadable. She read pages from the journal, her fingers tracing Silas's elegant script. She examined the tower's blueprints, which Alara had gotten copies of from Abernathy. When Alara was finished, Alani leaned back in her chair, her gaze piercing. "They want to bulldoze a monument to build a shopping mall," Alani said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "It's the oldest story in the book." She looked at Alara, a slow smile spreading across her face. "I'll take the case," with Alani on her side. The dynamic of the fight shifted. They were no longer on the defensive. They went on the attack. Their first move was a masterstroke. Using Silas's journal, the original blueprints, and the historical records unearthed by Mr. Abernathy, Alani filed an emergency petition with the city's Historical Landmark Commission. The petition argued that the Thorne Tower was a structure of immense historical and cultural significance, a forgotten masterpiece of early 20th century engineering and a vital monument to the city's African-American history. It was a direct challenge to the demolition order and to Ethelred's development plans. The petition was a bombshell. Julian Sterling and Ethelred were caught completely off guard. They had been prepared for a fight with a broke, desperate woman, not a legal challenge from a high-powered attorney armed with impeccable historical evidence. The story was picked up by a local investigative journalist, a woman Alani knew who had a penchant for stories about corporate greed. The headline read, "Forgotten Genius. Corporation seeks to demolish black inventor's historic clock tower." The narrative had been flipped. Alara was no longer a sentimental obstructionist standing in the way of progress. She was the guardian of a priceless piece of the city's heritage. Ethelred, the self-proclaimed revitalizers, were now cast as the villains, the erasers of history. Sterling was furious. He called Alara, his voice stripped of its polished veneer, now raw with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" he seethed. "This is a private property dispute. You're turning it into a circus." "I'm telling the truth," Alara replied, her voice steady, the fear she had once felt now replaced by a cold resolve. "It's not just a building, Mr. Sterling. It's a legacy." The battle lines were drawn. The Landmark Commission scheduled a public hearing. It would be a showdown between Ethelred's team of high-priced corporate lawyers and Alani Hassan, armed with Silas Thorne's journal. The fate of the tower, and the secret it held, would be decided in a public forum. The stakes had never been higher. Alara felt the weight of 100 years of history on her shoulders. She was no longer just fighting for a building. She was fighting for the memory of Silas Thorne and the community he had sought to protect. She was fighting for a promise. In the days leading up to the hearing, she and Alani worked tirelessly, preparing their case. Abernathy joined their small team, his encyclopedic knowledge of the city's history proving invaluable. They were a tiny, scrappy army against a corporate titan. But as she stood with them in Alani's office, surrounded by maps, documents, and the powerful words of her ancestor, Alara felt, for the first time, that they had a chance. The pendulum, which had been still for so long, was beginning to swing. The day of the city council hearing arrived, gray and ominous, the sky a ceiling of wet concrete. The council chamber was packed, a standing-room-only theater for the final act of a drama that had captured the city's imagination. News cameras lined the back wall. Community activists, history buffs, and concerned citizens filled the public seating. Alara sat at a simple wooden table beside Alani Hassan, facing a long, raised dais where the council members sat, their faces impassive. Across the aisle sat Julian Sterling and a team of 4 lawyers from Ethelred Development, their expensive suits a uniform of corporate power. They looked confident, smug, like men who had never lost a fight and didn't intend to start now. The air in the room was thick with tension, a silent, crackling energy. Sterling's lead attorney went first. He was a silver-haired man with a voice like polished granite. He spoke of progress, of economic development, of urban renewal. He painted a picture of the old industrial sector reborn, a vibrant hub of commerce and modern living. He presented charts and architectural renderings of gleaming glass towers where the Thorn Tower now stood. He portrayed the tower as a dangerous, unstable ruin, a public menace, and a financial black hole. He dismissed the historical claims as sentimental nonsense, a desperate attempt by an opportunistic heir to extract a higher price for a worthless property. He was smooth, professional, and utterly contemptuous. He methodically dismantled their case, piece by piece, with zoning ordinances and engineering reports. By the time he was finished, Alara felt a familiar knot of despair tightening in her chest. The council members were nodding along, their expressions businesslike. They understood the language of money and progress. What could she possibly say to counter that? Then it was Alani's turn. She walked to the podium not with a stack of files, but with a single leather-bound book, Silas Thorne's journal. She didn't speak of zoning laws or property values. She spoke of history. She told the story of Silas Thorne, a brilliant man who built a masterpiece in an era that tried to crush him. She described the tower not as a ruin, but as a survivor, a testament to a community's resilience. Her voice filled the chamber, passionate and clear, weaving a narrative that was more powerful than any financial projection. Finally, she turned to Alara. "The council has heard from the lawyers and the developers," she said, her eyes sweeping across the dais. "Now, I think it's time you heard from the legacy itself. I call Alara Thorne." A hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to Alara as she walked to the podium, her legs shaking. She clutched the sides of the wooden lectern to steady herself. She saw Sterling's condescending smirk. She saw the impassive faces of the council. She saw the hopeful, anxious faces in the crowd. She took a deep breath and began to speak. She didn't use the notes Alani had helped her prepare. She spoke from the heart. She spoke of what it was like to grow up with nothing, to feel disconnected from your own past. She spoke of inheriting this tower, this dump, and what it had come to mean to her. "Mr. Sterling sees a building," she said, her voice quiet but carrying a surprising strength. "He sees a plot of land. He sees an obstacle to his vision of the future. But he is blind. He can't see what's really there." She opened the journal, its worn pages falling open to a passage she knew by heart. She read Silas's own words, his voice echoing across a century. "They can burn our businesses," she read, her voice gaining power. "They can erase our names from the ledgers, but they cannot steal what is built to last, what is hidden in plain sight, protected by the steady, unblinking march of time itself." She looked up from the journal, directly at the council members. "This tower is not an obstacle to the future. It is a bridge to our past. A past this city has tried very hard to forget. It is a monument to the idea that we can build things that last, that our stories matter, that our legacies are worth preserving." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room before landing on Sterling. "You cannot put a price on that. You call it a hazardous ruin. I call it a promise. And it is a promise I intend to keep," she finished, her heart hammering. The silence in the chamber was absolute. It stretched for a long, breathless moment. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to clap. A slow, solitary sound. It was followed by another, and another, until the entire room erupted in a wave of applause. The council members looked stunned, murmuring to one another. Sterling's face was a mask of disbelief and fury. He had lost control of the narrative. In that moment, Alara knew she had won. It wasn't about legal arguments or financial incentives. She had made it about history, about identity, about the very soul of the city. The council's vote was a formality. The motion to grant the Thorn Tower historical landmark status passed unanimously. The demolition order was void. Ethelred was defeated. After, in the chaotic scrum of reporters and well-wishers, Elara saw Mr. Abernathy. He was smiling, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Time tells all," he said, patting her hand. "You made them listen, the fight was over. The tower was safe. The secret was secure." As Elara left the council building, stepping out into the late afternoon light, she felt a profound sense of peace. She looked up at the sky, where somewhere across the city, her tower stood, silent and waiting. She had not just saved a building. She had reclaimed a history. She had honored a legacy. She hadn't inherited a fortune. She had inherited a responsibility, a purpose that was larger and more meaningful than any amount of money. The final scene is not of victory, but of beginning. Months later, the Thorn Tower is no longer derelict. Scaffolding surrounds its spire as a team of preservationists, funded by the newly established Thorn Foundation, works to restore its stone and copper skin. Inside, the great clockwork has been meticulously cleaned and repaired. Elara stands with Leo on the observation deck, looking out over the city. She has established the foundation, anonymously funded by the first carefully liquidated assets from the Freedom Fund. Its mission is to provide scholarships, small business loans, and community grants, planting the seeds of Silas's legacy back into the community it came from. Below them, in the heart of the tower, the great pendulum begins to swing for the first time in 100 years. A deep, resonant tick echoes up through the structure, a sound of time reawakened. It is followed by a talk, a steady, powerful rhythm. The heartbeat has returned. As the first chime of the newly restored bells rings out across the city, a clear, hopeful note that cuts through the urban hum, Elara looks at her son. He is watching the city with wide, wondrous eyes. His future a landscape of possibilities she could once only dream of. She understands now. The true treasure was never the gold in the vault. It was the purpose of the tower itself, to mark time, to serve the community, and to stand as a permanent, defiant reminder that some things are built to last. The pendulum swings, and a new century begins.